Israeli coast, there are very few places where the bottom of the sea is not very rocky and where the boats can dock safely. So the harbor of Caesarea provided one of the safe havens, and King Herod engaged into a very massive construction project, and Josephus said with his amazement it was finished in 20 years. It was built as a regular Roman city, but of course as Herod was a Jewish king, he wanted to please Jews as well. But from the very beginning it was not just a Jewish city, but it was, you know, international, so to say, community. Anyway, this territory was still, so to say, Roman mandate, was part of the Roman Empire. And how Herod the Great paid for this? Well, surprisingly, agriculture was of great help. There is a lot of fertile land along the Caesarea, and there were mighty gardens where various fruits were raised and shipped off to Rome, and some were quite pricey. And as weather is very favorable in this region, the trade in fruit and gardening, wine and olive oil brought quite big profit. The excavation that we're going to see today, the historical site, does not uncover all of the territory of the Herodian city. We're going to see the theater, we're going to see the remnant of the palace, where the procurators lived, including Pontius Pilate. Don't forget that Jerusalem was not the capital at this time. It was the Caesarea Maritima, the Caesarea of the sea, was the capital of this region. And in later Roman era and during the Byzantine times, it grew to become one of the largest cities in the Middle East. Was estimated 100,000 people living there. But then after the invasions of the 7th century and the earthquakes, the city was reduced. Although there was an attempt by the Muslim rulers of this region to revive the city, however, it never played its importance as it once played. During the times of the Crusades, there was a fortress built and within the premise of the city. We're going to see the Crusader fortress, but of course it was considerably smaller than the city of the Roman and Byzantine period. On our left-hand side, you already can see what looks like a pile of sand and dirt, but actually the ancient suburbs of Caesarea were already around here. Not all of it was excavated, it was partially built over, but we're going to visit the historical park. As our company yesterday, an archaeologist said that on average 2 to 5% of every archaeological site excavated only. So in Caesarea, of course, a little bit more than that was excavated, but the emphasis was made on the most important structures.
Caesarea.
Alright, here we are. Please make sure to take some water with you. Hat. And we'll start our exploration. Now, bus is not going to be here. We are going to a different location.
Повернись, повернись
Сергей, иди сюда.
Повернись.
Иди сюда.
Вот.
Mentions, and of course we can't read everything, but we're going to read just several passages. The first passage is from the chapter 10 of the book of Acts, talking about the Cornelius, the centurion, whom Apostle Peter would baptize, and then he has a vision. At Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household, gave alms liberally to the people, and prayed constantly to God. About the 9th hour of the day he saw clearly in a vision an angel of God coming in and saying to him, Cornelius. And he stared at him in terror and said, What is, Lord? And he said to him, Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and bring one Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with Simon a tanner whose house is by the seaside. When the angel spoke to him had departed, he called two of his servants and a devout soldier from among those that waited on him, and having related everything to them, he sent them to Joppa. Another is from the chapter 23, and it tells already that Paul is arrested, and he has to be tried by the procurator, and procurator was not in Jerusalem. When we say, how about Pontius Pilate, who was the procurator in Jerusalem? Well, he was not procurator in Jerusalem all the time. He was coming there whenever there was a need for such, but Jerusalem overall was viewed as very troublesome. You know, there is a fantasy book, you know, it's kind of a perversion of the gospel by Mikhail Bulgakov, Master and Margarita, and it describes how Pontius Pilate hated Jerusalem. Well, in reality we don't know whether he hated Jerusalem or not, but the fact that it very well may reflect in that particular part the historical reality, because Jerusalem was troublesome. Why? It was capital of the Jews, there was a temple there. So if the rites to start, they are likely to start where the temple is. So they had a garrison there, but overall any of the Roman officials did not like to stay in Jerusalem. It was a strange city, it was an old city, it was a rebuilt city, but they preferred to stay in Caesarea that was exactly according to their liking. It was built by Herod to accommodate the tastes of Romans. And here in chapter 23 we see that Paul is already arrested, but he's a Roman citizen, so he has to be tried by the Roman court. So he's sent to Caesarea. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of the ambush. The Jews were trying to set an ambush when Paul would be on the road to Caesarea in order to execute him. Of course, Paul was a persecutor of Christians. He was a renowned Pharisee, the student of Gamaliel, and his conversion was a very severe blow to the party that persecuted early Christians, you know, the followers of Jesus of Nazarene. And there was a great desire to avenge him, and, you know, traitor is worse than enemy. He is a traitor. So now the sons of Paul's sister heard of the ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions and said, Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you. The tribune took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, What is that you have to tell me? And he said, The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of their men lie in ambush for him, having bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor to drink till they had killed him, and now they are ready waiting for the promise from you. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, Tell no one that you have informed me of this. And then he called 2 of the centurions and said, At the 3rd hour of the night get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride, and bring him safely to Felix the governor, whom he wrote a letter to this effect. And then there is a text of the letter. But again, he's brought to where? He's brought here to Caesarea to be tried in the palace of the governor, and the ruins of that palace we're going to see. Another mentioning of Caesarea is in chapter 25. Well, let me find the accurate passage. Tony just pointed out. Is she anywhere around? She just had it a second ago. Yes, Paul before Agrippa and Bernice. Huh?
So as good a translation.
So okay, Acts 20, chapter 13, verse 13. Now, when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived in Caesarea to welcome Festus. Who was Agrippa? Agrippa was Jewish king. Herod's kingdom was divided into three parts, and Agrippa was one of the successors here in the region of Galilee. But they were puppet kings because real Romans were in charge. To welcome Festus, and as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews gave information about him, asking for sentence against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face, and had an opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. When therefore they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat at the tribunal, and ordered the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed, but they had certain points of dispute with him about their own superstition about one Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wished to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I commanded him to hold until I could send him to Caesar. And Agrippa said to Festus, I should like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow then, he said, you shall hear him. And all this was transpiring here in Jerusalem. Paul's case was very complicated because he had the rights of Roman citizen. He was, according to his own word, sowing the tents for the Roman army, and by that he gained himself Roman citizenship. And the Romans were entitled to the right judgment. For that even Jews had charges against him. He could appeal what he would do to the court of the Caesar because he's a Roman citizen and he's entitled to these rights. So in Roman law obviously superseded the law of any local puppet kingdoms. For that he will be sent to the Rome where he would eventually die, but along that he'll still continue to missionize people and bringing them to Christ. Now, it is very hot. I'm going to lead you to this theater right now. It is rather nicely preserved. It dates back to the time of Herod. We're talking about the late 1st century BC, early 1st century AD. A little quiz question, just to wake you up a little bit, as I see that you're getting a little bit relaxed. What is the difference between Roman theater and Greek theater?
Oval.
No.
No.
Wrong.
Actually, the idea of putting two theaters together is a Roman idea. Thinking of Colosseum, it's a later development. I'm talking the difference. Romans had theaters, Greeks had theaters. What is the difference?
Nothing.
А? Чем греческий отличался от римского театра? Чем? Нет, ну они все вот такой вот формы, да?
Там помост, наверное, был такой для артистов.
No, the stage for the actors. No, both had stage for the actors. Any ideas?
Romans had games and Greeks had...
No, not in the theater. Not in the theater. Not in the theater. Amen. Greeks always utilized natural stops when Roman started to build support walls and building amphitheaters in the shape. And usually a Roman theater or Greek theater looked like a full crescent with a big wall, which we're going to see in Jerash. There was a big wall where all the equipment for the theater stages were held. So walls usually were dismantled, but some theaters remain. Actually, this theater is used until the present day for various shows. Those of you fans of Russian rock group DDT, they performed here 2 weeks ago. I admire Shevchuk for his Christian content of his songs, so they performed here just a while ago. So, but the idea of putting two theaters together was a late Roman invasion. Another quiz question. Oh, you don't want any more? No.
Go ahead.
There is a canon law that prohibits Christians to marry actors, and in particular, if somebody married an actor, he is prohibited to be among the ranks of the clergy. I know that I explained to some of you why that. So those of you who already know, please do not answer. I want to hear it from somebody who may know it from different sources. You know, like Emperor Justinian, it was a big deal. He married his wife, who was an actress, and it was a source of big controversy. Now they're both canonized. But when he married her, it caused a great scandal. But until the present day, sometimes people coming and saying, well, is it, you know, why we can't marry, you know, an actress, or why a pious Christian woman can't marry an actor? Any ideas?
Ну, душу свою артисты отдают другим, перевоплощаясь.
Ну хорошо. Well, this is they sell their soul by pretending to be someone else. Yes, but if it's a good Christian play, if it's a moral play, if they bring people through their performing act toward Christ, there are such Christian plays. In medieval era, there were many Christian plays. You know, think of Obermargrau, where the entire village made a resolution every 10 years to perform the Passions of Christ in thanksgiving for delivering them from plague. It's also stage performance. So any ideas? Well, I'll tell you. And this is a little bit salty here. The fact is that when Church of the Canons were written, you know, we're thinking the beginning of the theater in Greek, tragedies and comedies. And usually they were very moralistic. But the stage performance was always related to a cult. But cult becomes boring if there is no spice added to it. And of course in the theater everything is exaggerated. So always masks that were depicting what's going to be shown, you know, tragedy or comedy. All the emotions were exaggerated. A lot of, what you call it, grim, you know, yeah, facial features added and everything else. So when the Romans inherited the theater, what Romans were most interested, because they were exposed to things of the known world, performance of the theater become increasingly pornographic. Theater was considered to be, as today, you know, a life adult entertainment. It was not just a stage performance that has any kind of moral. It usually appealed to the lowest of the human desires. And there were, you know, particular houses right across the street from the theater, and John Chrysostom just bashes people for going to theater, because saying even if you're not going to be affected by performance in the theater, which you cannot be, then you're going to be exposed to all the perversions that will be available next to it. That's why Christian Church banned marrying the actors and actresses, because they were involved in outward perversion. It is not about the stage performance of great Christian values, but the time when canons were written, it had very particular meaning. So I'm very often saying, well, canons are not to be reviewed, they set in stone and everything else, and I tend to agree with it overall. But in certain cases, certain things need to be reinterpreted. And of course, when Justinian chose his wife from among the actresses, Procopius in his Secret Life of the Empress described in graphic detail what happened to her before. But she had a conversion experience, she became true Christian, you know, and was renowned not to her performances on stage, but through her charity and work of love. Well, anyway, shall we see the Roman theater?
Yes, let's go.
You think so? No.
Theaters. We see the revival of arenas in France and Spain. Corrida games are held exactly the same place as it was held 2,000 years ago. Same place where Christians were put to death. And the theater is more and more used for various, you know, type of performances. Usually it's a good custom to let you climb up to the theater to hear the acoustics and to take pictures. I beg you not to do that now, because you're going to see even more splendid theater in Girard. Sorry, Father Lawrence. But we're going to see a larger theater, much larger theater in Jordan, and much better preserved. This theater was revived and gives you a good idea of how the theaters look like. Of course, places on the lower levels were reserved for VIPs, for various nobility. Middle rows were preserved for men of means, and the further up you go, they were reserved for people with less and less means. And on top there were slaves and women. Yeah. As not to hear to the exclamation, "Oh, look at this!" So, as not to interrupt the show, they were kept at a safe distance, as not to interrupt the show performance. So over here, where you're going to see the rooms, there would have been a very big stage. Usually it would be the same height as the height of the upper level of the amphitheater. And also theaters very often had roofs, so if it would be a hot day as today, shows were running through the day as well. They would have a little canopy that would provide enough shade for people to sit in the shade and enjoy themselves. And it was very intricate designs, and in Jerash you'll be able to work sort of behind the stage and to see where the placeful mechanisms were. And time on here, it's just as you see it here. Well, let us proceed, and on the way I'd like to show you one of the ancient sarcophagus, pagan sarcophagus, pagan's place of burial. Sarcophagus, especially the mighty ones, were used many times. Many people don't even know of the original. Over here, although we know one of the inhabitants, or more, we know about one person. Yes. Well, over here we see we see the remnants of the palace of the procurators. So it was also the residence of Pontius Pilate, it was residence of Felix. And Apostle Paul was tried somewhere on the premises of this palace. It is hard to imagine the entire layout of how everything have looked like. The marine harbor of Caesarea. Caesarea was a huge town. Caesarea is a huge town. It lasted further up. Wherever you see the minaret over there, marks approximately half of the ancient Caesarea. It was stretched along the sea, and what was excavated, only the southern part was excavated. Northern part is yet to be excavated. And of course there are a lot of facilities that go toward east from here, behind the line of the trees, and there are of course various buildings still at the top, and it would be impossible to revive everything. Parsley, that under the sun, even like today, would die in no time, just in several minutes. So when he says that we should run for Christ, how much more so if they put so much physical effort to run for a wreath made of a parsley, then how much more effort we have to put to run when we're running for Christ. And now, before any groups, let's go to the stone right over there. It's an incredible historical document. Proving that he was. Now, if you want to find the historical evidence, you can purchase a coin with name Caiaphas for about $20 if it's in poor shape. If it's in a perfect shape, it would cost you about $200. There will be a palm there and name Caiaphas. But back in the 19th century, when archaeology was in its infancy, many things were not discovered, and many things people looked very, very different. Pontius Pilate did not exist outside the gospel and outside the creed until 1970. Until here on the premises of the palace, the stone was found. Well, this is replica. This is replica. The original is, of course, the Museum of Israel for its extreme value. Okay, but here we see the stele of the dedication to Emperor Tiberius by Pontius Pilatus. Okay, so we have a Roman monument. In the last 5 minutes I have not heard a single request about the toilet facilities. So if any of you want to join me, you're most welcome to do so here and now.
Come on, let's get all the. Oh, we only have one priest in robes now. Let's get them all lined up there and get a photo.
Okay? That money do not smell. Have you? Or not? Money does not smell. Have you heard that expression?
Yes, yes, I
Yeah,
have.
it's a rather popular. Do you know where it comes from? No,
It's Russian.
As I told the story, in some of the ancient ruins were more public facilities and more apparent villages. There were way to bleach the material. And how do you bleach, for instance, linen or something like that and make it pure white? Not only, there were much more effective way by using human urine. And there were special people who were collecting urine from the public facilities and were utilizing it. And they were not taxed. It was Emperor Vespasian who decided to tax the collection of urine. And when somebody wrote, "How could you?" he said, "Well, money does not smell." Thus the saying. Деньги не пахнут. Откуда пошли? В человеческой моче отбеливали ткань. И эта деятельность не облагалась налогом. Император Веспасиан ввел налог. Когда ему написали, как ты можешь вводить налог на мочу, он сказал, ну деньги-то не пахнут. All right?
Not happening.
The chariot races or when the runners were performing. That would be go on their side, and those stadiums would be the largest public facilities. The largest one from among the known ones is in Rome and could accommodate 250,000 people.
Oh, yeah.
Colosseum in comparison could accommodate about 80,000 people, but if it's, you know, packed shoulder to shoulder. Can please somebody do me a pious service and put it in their backpack? Sergey, есть сумочку? That's where Pontius Pilate would be sitting. Of course, it's a modern day recreation, but this the places for nobility, right? You know, not in the middle necessarily of the theater, but you know, the prime spot where he would look for the chariot races. Those of you who know a little bit of Byzantine history would probably would know about the conflict of blues and greens. Well, you know, not very much familiar with American football teams, but with Giants versus Yankees or
Yeah, something like that.
something like that. And the chariot almost and the riot almost destroyed the empire. 60,000 people were called in suppression of that rebellion. So, well, you know, fans remain fans forever. You know, no different from 2,000 years ago to today. But this was an entertainment. It was part of Pax. That was part of Pax Romana. That you entitled to food, you entitled to entertainment. Okay, and you entitled to the just judgment according to the Roman tradition. Okay. Baths can have a very good idea of what Roman baths look like, because Byzantine inherited from the Romans, and when the Turks came, it was obviously inherited from the Byzantines. So we know what now is known as the Turkish bath is in fact Roman bath. And we go under this little place in shade, and you can see much larger area. Those of you who went yesterday to Masada saw the idea of it. There was a furnace outside that was heated, and hot air was pumped or circulated under the floor of one facility. And in certain places there were clay tubes attached to the wall. On certain places there were not, but there were many columns, and the wall was mounted on top of them. So the heat radiated, the heat always rises. So you proceeded from one pole to the other, gradually from hotter environment to the cooler one. And with hot and cold water, and there was a special perfumes and oils that you anointed yourself, and there was a special metal scrubs, like scrubs or something, that you can, scrub yourself and do it several times, and then wash yourself and then be anointed with various fragrant oils. So you're coming out of the bath really with good understanding of cleanliness. So our beliefs about ancient people, especially Roman culture, being dirty and smelly, is not necessarily accurate, because all people of means had access to the public baths that were built at the expense of the state and were open for everybody. In fact, baths were so popular that in new conquered territories, those were one of the first facilities that were built because they were extremely fascinating.
Вон они выжили уже столько времени. Look at me. Look at me.
Hold it. I didn't get it.
Come on. I'm getting tired. It's heavy,
Got you?
You got me.
It's actually super appealing. Well, for the most part, the road was very nicely fitted. Even here, it's not as good fitted, as nicely fitted as you may imagine, because of course, over the time, the mortar in between the stones disappeared, and stones themselves were fitted much nicer. If you ever been to New York and saw the underground railroad going actually above the city streets, Romans used somewhat of the same thing. They had actually sewage system, and sewage system was quite advanced. Aqueducts were bringing fresh water into the cities. In that regard, they were by far more advanced than people of medieval times. They had running fresh water, and sometimes aqueducts were building for miles and miles and miles. In fact, we're going to see aqueduct later on that supplied Caesarea with water. And under the streets they had a very big openings that were used for sewerage, and they were openings. So in case of rain or some dirt, it was all washed away and collected in those tubes, and they were taking it outside the city. Well, of course, we're talking about Herodian Roman town, so he wanted to do it like in Roman Empire, and obviously used Roman engineers. But in more advanced towns, they also would have city fountains, and in some cities like Rome, they function until the present day, still can drink fresh water and not getting sick. And the main construction, underground construction, date back to the time of Romans. But what was also interesting is that on the sides of the streets there were fountains. So from the public aqueduct, there were access to the private houses, so you can have running water in your private house. And the excess water would be collecting in the fountains, and fountains would be overflowing. And the street level usually was by at least 2, if not 2.5 feet lower than the sidewalk where pedestrians would walk. And they would have massive slabs, so you can cross from one street to the other if you need it. And what would be happening with an with excess water that was running from the fountains? It would be overflowing to the streets. So, and when citizens of the town throwing some rubbish on the streets, it would be washed away and taken away outside the city walls by those underground systems. So it was kind of ingenious for the idea. So Roman towns were not, smelly as it was in medieval times. What? Yes, in Pompeii. If you've been to Pompeii, you can see that. You can very well imagine the system, really at work.
The two who are working on the walls.
And it should.
Excuse me? Yes, they're refurbishing, they're doing some of the restoration or what have you. Here we can see already the remnants of the Byzantine government, and here we can see the remnants of Byzantine customs. Whoever the tradesmen were coming in, they had to present with their goods for inspection and pay tax Actually, we'll have to say that Byzantine tax system laid into the undermining of the Byzantine Palestine and its failure. Byzantines who saw that as a religious duty to defend the orthodoxy were taxing different sorts of Christians on different levels. They were taxing Orthodox on one rate and heterodox on the other rate. So when the Muslims came, they were all taxing on the same base because all of them were infidels, all of them were Christians. But that tax was viewed as a more fair system. Very often people do not fight for their faith, they fight for very practical material advantage. So advancement of the Muslims, who were actually at the beginning seen as one of the stranger Christian sects, was viewed with welcoming hands, and that underlined the Byzantine failure here in the Middle East. Okay? All right. The Arabs were usually leveled with the ground level. It was choresome enough to rebuild them, and this doesn't present really too big of a struggle. But Crusaders or Europeans at large perfected their skill of fortress building. After the Crusades, the art of war took a significant and a completely different level. Here they had to face an enemy who tactical was by far superior. Crusaders were very much like a tank army. Knights were very well trained and very well equipped, but there was a relatively few number of them. But they were unstoppable as an armade. They would go on the battlefield and just smash everything along their way. There is a description of one battle between two English parties during the War of the Roses, and there were several thousand people on each man, and then they said 30 knights rode on the battlefield, and the course of the battle was entirely changed. So, equipment of the knight cost a lot of money. It took a lot of training for them to do, and Crusader army, being significantly smaller than the army of the Muslims, performed really well. What led to their downfall is that very quickly they realized that trading and investing into commerce pays much better than fighting for the holy places. And quarrels of Crusader states here for 150 years were multiple cases where Muslims would hire Christian mercenaries to fight, and Crusaders would fight Muslim mercenaries to fight between the petty kingdoms and petty borders. But nevertheless, here we are at the Crusader fortress of Caesarea, and it was according to the understanding of the time to build a large moat around the city as to prevent enemies to come closer in order to storm the walls. So you needed to fit the moat with something before you can actually climb the walls, and you do it under the rain of arrows and stones and rocks and fire and everything else. Well, of course, here we have trouble with the water. Sea is there, but how are you going to bring water to the higher ground? Well, actually, in this mode there was never water. Crusader didn't need it water. What they would do, they would build the moats, and on the bottom they would put very sharp sticks. So if somebody who's wounded would fall, he would be scratched, and very often they would also cut various sorts of animals or use animals' guts to paint, to spray that upon the sticks.
Like spikes.
Like spikes, exactly. Medieval warfare, or most people in medieval warfare, didn't die on the battlefield. They died because of the wounds. There was no way to heal the infection. So even if you by accident fall and you're pierced by the spike a little bit, and it's not a mortal wound, within a week you have an inflammation and you are gone. So most of the casualties were not real on the battlefield, but in the aftermath of the battlefield. So if you again see the movie of the Crusader, historically completely useless, but it has some historically accurate moments where the knight is dying because of the infection. He was shot by an arrow, and infection developed and he dies.
And then gangrene.
Exactly. Well, and that's how much so if you have some animal fat or remnant of the animal fat or blood or something, in such weather, infection is guaranteed and you're a goner. And you're absolutely a goner.
It's the idea, the infection, even the Second World War, sometimes they employ not to kill, but rather to wound, because it takes more people to, assuming that the Germans and the others would, send aid, it takes those people off the battlefield.
Correct.
So a lot of the strategy in the Second World War is just using different
Well, up to
methods.
invention of penicillin, the infection was the largest killer. Not actually the arms, but the infection.
There's a lot of penicillin in urine.
Nah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
full of
Right. Well, but then whether they knew or not, that's a different story.
No, in survival, we're taught that if you have an open wound, to urinate on it right away.
So nice view over here on the Roman fortifications. If you'd like to take pictures, and let us go.
Видишь, такие мелочи.
Coming true. It was a significant seaport, but in 1187, after Salah ad-Din destroyed the the combined forces of the Crusader kingdom in Galilee, not far from the lake, not far from the lake of Galilee, Sea of Galilee, Crusader had to withdraw from Caesarea as well. And the last remaining seaport was the so-called Kingdom of Archeological, that is about halfway between here and Haifa, which is halfway between here. And their kingdom lasted for another approximately 50 years. For those of you who are interested in the history of the Crusades, I can recommend to read a 3-volume book by Sir Stephen Ransom called The History of the Crusades. It's perhaps the most precise and engaging book. It reads much better even than The Lord of the Rings. There is by far more action in it.
Interesting.
Ransom, Stephen Ransom.
He writes on Byzantine history.
Correct, you're right. Well, he's an excellent author, but his history of the Crusade perhaps the most concise. What I personally like about him, he is Byzantinophile to the tears in his eyes. So even when Byzantines absolutely do not deserve any justification, he finds the way to intervene and to make them the right guys in time when they obviously are not as good of a guys at all. So. Yes, so but Ransom and Stephen Ransom.
He has a second book. Maybe you've read, The Great Church in Captivity.
Oh no, he has about 20 books.
Well, okay.
You know, he has lots and lots of books. But he deals with all various periods of Byzantine history, mainly with later ones. But it's very interesting to read. He was an Anglican, but he converted, pretty much on his deathbed, he converted to Orthodoxy. He was received into the Orthodox Church in England. That's not a very well-known fact, but I know a friend of mine who practically witnessed his conversion into the Orthodox Church. A friend of Bishop Callistus Ware. Okay.